like we'll call it mindful eating, right? And again, like these are shades within shades, because if we're using mindful eating, like that's, we use that when we're portion control, we use that when we're calorie and macro tracking, but it is a distinct method in and of itself, right? And what I mean by mindful eating is like we're actually learning to listen to the internal cues, right, of our body, right? Now, I would argue that this is pretty ineffective method unless we've already got some structure in place in terms of, protein intake, in terms of vegetable intake, etc. Because most people are going to have a terrible like hunger response unless they actually have an effective diet set up, right? So it kind of, you have to have other things in place before you utilize this method only. But once you're using another method, again, your calorie macro tracking, you're doing whatever, and then you start layering on like mindful eating in terms of listening to your hunger cues, listening to, how satiated you feel after that meal, how that meal makes you feel energy wise, how did you time that meal? Like, did you eat it too soon? You were feeling bloated, maybe. Did you eat it too far away? You were feeling hungry. You're a bit angry before your meal. Like, what was going on, right? And once we dial that in, we can actually dial in a lot of different things, right? So let's assume that calories and protein are already taken care of, right? Because they're the two big ones. You're probably going to need to use some sort of portion control and some sort of calorie macro tracking to get those dialed in, right? Not always, but for most people, that's an easier method. And if we then layer on some sort of like mindful eating where we're like, all right, we need to actually dial in on how do you feel in response to this meal? How do you feel when you get to this meal? How does it feel in terms of when this meal is timed? How does it feel, everything about that meal? Like when do you feel hungry throughout that meal? When do you feel satiated? Like what are the actual responses to that? Are you actually tasting the meal? Is it good? Like that kind of stuff. We're asking ourselves these more subjective questions, right? Because it's your response, your individual response to it, right? And once we start dialing that in, you can actually get so much granularity with the diet. Like you can start timing the diet down to an absolute T for you, like it's absolutely, you couldn't get it more perfectly, right? So that is something that's really important regardless of the diet methods you use, but it is also in and of itself a practice we could engage in so that we could be on track with a fat loss diet, right? Like you could start listening to hunger cues. You could start listening to, satiety cues overall, right? Now, the issue with this is in like, say, obesity, you might not have, we'll call it quote unquote normal, hunger cues. You might not have normal satiety cues. Like if you're eating absolute crap as well, you're probably not going to have normal hunger or satiety cues. Like anyone who's eating like say something like a McDonald's or something, yourself, like you're literally hungry an hour later and you're like, I've just eaten fucking 1,000 calories. How am I still hungry? Whereas if you had 1,000 calories of, I don't know, fucking broccoli or something, you'd be like, I'm actually stuffed for 3 days, So it's like, you need to already be on track with a lot of things to make mindful eating work effectively, right? Because if this intuitive mindful eating approach just worked out the bat, like out the gate, you're just able to go for it, like it would work for everyone. That's all we'd say. We just say, oh, listen to your hunger, and that would solve everyone's fucking issue, right? And obviously that doesn't work like that. There's a lot more nuance to it. You do have to have a lot of things in place initially if we want this to work.